The crimson sunset over Nevada's desert painted the sky like spilled blood, casting long shadows across the Silverbrook Valley. Martha Clearwater stood on the wraparound porch of her modest ranch house, her weathered hands gripping the wooden railing as she watched dust clouds rise from the eastern ridge. The approaching riders moved with purpose, their silhouettes dark against the dying light. At 43, Martha carried herself with the quiet dignity of a woman who had weathered more storms than most. Her auburn hair, streaked with premature silver, was pulled back in a practical bun beneath a worn black bonnet. The simple calico dress she wore had been mended countless times, yet she wore it with the bearing of a queen. Her green eyes, sharp as cut glass, missed nothing as they tracked the approaching horsemen. The valley stretched before her like an emerald jewel set in the harsh Nevada landscape. Silverbrook Creek meandered through the center, its waters catching the last rays of sunlight like scattered diamonds. Cottonwoods lined its banks, their leaves whispering secrets in the evening breeze. Beyond the creek, her late husband's cattle grazed peacefully, unaware that their tranquil world was about to shatter. Martha's fingers unconsciously moved to the locket at her throat, a simple silver piece that held more secrets than anyone in Silverbrook Valley could imagine. Inside lay not a photograph, but something far more precious and dangerous, a folded piece of parchment that could topple empires and expose truths that powerful men would kill to keep buried. The sound of approaching hoofbeats grew louder, accompanied by the jingle of spurs and the creak of leather. Martha counted 8 riders, their faces obscured by the shadows of wide-brimmed hats. At their head rode a man whose very presence seemed to poison the evening air. Even from a distance, she recognized the expensive cut of his black suit, the gleam of silver buttons, and the arrogant set of his shoulders. Ezekiel Blackwood, the railroad tycoon whose iron tentacles stretched across the American West like a spider's web. Martha had never met the man face to face, but his reputation preceded him like the stench of sulfur. Newspapers from San Francisco to Denver chronicled his ruthless business practices, his willingness to crush anyone who stood between him and profit. Towns that refused to bend to his will found themselves bypassed by his rails, left to wither and die in the desert sun. The riders drew rein at the edge of her property, their horses snorting and pawing the hard-packed earth. Blackwood himself rode a magnificent black stallion that seemed as dark and temperamental as its master. The man's face was sharp-featured and pale, with cold blue eyes that reminded Martha of winter ice. A carefully waxed mustache adorned his upper lip, and a gold tooth flashed when he smiled, which he did now, though there was no warmth in the expression. "Mrs. Clearwater, I presume," Blackwood called out, his voice carrying the cultured tones of Eastern education mixed with Western authority. "A pleasure to finally make your acquaintance. My name is Ezekiel Blackwood, president of the Continental Western Railroad Company." Martha remained silent, her hand steady on the porch railing. She had learned long ago that silence could be a weapon more powerful than any revolver. Let him reveal his hand first. Blackwood's smile faltered slightly at her lack of response. He dismounted with practiced ease, his spurs ringing against the ground as he approached the porch. His men remained mounted, their hands resting casually near their sidearms, Colt peacemakers, by the look of them. The newest model that had become the standard for gunfighters and lawmen alike since 1873. "I've come to discuss a business proposition," Blackwood continued, removing his hat to reveal thinning dark hair slicked back with pomade. One that could prove quite profitable for a woman in your circumstances. The emphasis on the last word was deliberate, a reminder of her widowed status and presumed vulnerability. Martha's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, but she maintained her composure. 3 years had passed since consumption had taken her beloved Samuel. 3 years of running the ranch alone and proving to the world that Martha Clearwater was nobody's victim. "Speak your piece, Mr. Blackwood," she said finally, her voice carrying the clear tones of a woman educated beyond her apparent station. "The sun's setting, and I have chores to attend to." Blackwood's eyes glittered with amusement at what he clearly perceived as false bravado. "Direct? I admire that in a woman. Very well. Mrs. Clearwater, the Continental Western Railroad requires a route through Silverbrook Valley for our expansion into California. Your property sits directly in the path of progress." He gestured grandly toward the valley, as if he were a conquering general surveying his domain. "I'm prepared to offer you a fair price for your land, more than fair. Actually, $3,000 for the entire ranch, enough to relocate somewhere more, suitable for a woman of your circumstances." Martha's laugh was soft, but sharp as broken glass. $3,000, Mr. Blackwood. I fear your intelligence regarding my circumstances is somewhat lacking. This ranch encompasses 1,200 acres of prime grazing land, with water rights that extend back to the territorial charter of 1864. The land alone is worth 10 times your offer. A flicker of surprise crossed Blackwood's features, quickly replaced by cold calculation. Clearly, he hadn't expected to deal with a woman who understood land values and legal terminology. His men shifted in their saddles, hands moving slightly closer to their weapons. "I see you've done your homework," Blackwood said slowly. "However, I think you misunderstand the nature of this negotiation. The railroad will come through this valley. Mrs. Clearwater, with or without your cooperation. The question is whether you'll profit from progress or be swept aside by it." The threat hung in the evening air like smoke from a distant fire. Martha's hand moved almost unconsciously to her locket, feeling the weight of the secret it contained. If Blackwood knew who she really was, what legacy flowed through her veins, he would never have dared to make such a threat. But that secret was her greatest weapon precisely because it was hidden. "I'll need time to consider your generous offer," Martha said, her tone carefully neutral. "Surely a man of your stature can allow a poor widow a few days to make such a momentous decision." Blackwood's smile returned, sharp and predatory. "Of course, I'm not an unreasonable man. Shall we say 3 days I'll be staying at the Grand Hotel in Carson City, conducting other business. I do hope you'll see reason. Mrs. Clearwater, it would be such a shame if this beautiful valley were to suffer the consequences of unfortunate decisions." With that thinly veiled threat, Blackwood remounted his stallion and wheeled the horse around. His men followed suit, their horses' hooves raising a cloud of dust as they rode back toward the eastern ridge. Martha remained on the porch until the sound of hoofbeats faded into the distance, her green eyes tracking their movement with the intensity of a hawk watching its prey. Only when she was certain they were gone did she allow herself to sink into the old rocking chair that had been Samuel's favorite spot to watch the sunset. Her hands trembled slightly as she opened the locket and withdrew the folded parchment within. The paper was yellowed with age, but the ink remained clear and dark, a testament to the importance of the words written upon it. The document was dated July 15, 1862, and bore the official seal of the United States Congress. At the top, in flowing script, were the words that could shake the very foundations of Blackwood's railroad empire: Pacific Railway Act, amended land, grant provisions. Section 47, subsection C. Martha's great-grandfather, Jeremiah Clearwater, had been more than just a humble settler. He had been a surveyor for the federal government, one of the men responsible for mapping the routes that would eventually become the Transcontinental Railroad. What nobody knew, what had been buried in bureaucratic files and forgotten by history, was that Jeremiah had also been instrumental in drafting the amended land grant provisions that governed railroad construction. Section 47, subsection C, was a safeguard that Jeremiah had insisted upon, a protection for existing landowners against exactly the kind of railroad tyranny that Blackwood now represented. The provision stated clearly that any railroad company seeking to claim land through eminent domain must first prove that no existing water rights or territorial charters conflicted with their proposed route. More importantly, if such conflicts existed, the railroad must either pay fair market value as determined by independent appraisal or find an alternate route. The Clearwater family's water rights predated the Pacific Railway Act by 2 years, making Martha's claim to Silverbrook Valley legally unassailable. But more than that, the document in her locket contained something that would terrify Blackwood and his corporate masters, evidence that the Continental Western Railroad had been systematically violating Section 47 across multiple territories, stealing land from legitimate owners through intimidation, fraud, and violence. Martha refolded the precious document and returned it to her locket. 3 days. She had 3 days to decide how to use this weapon, and she intended to use them wisely. The memory of Samuel's voice echoed in her mind, words he had spoken during their last conversation before the consumption claimed him. "Martha, my dear," he had whispered, his once strong hands gripping hers with fading strength. "That locket holds more than just our family's legacy. It holds the power to right wrongs that have been festering for too long. When the time comes, and you'll know when it comes, don't be afraid to use it. Truth finds its level, like water seeking low ground." The stars were beginning to appear in the darkening sky, bright pinpricks of light in the vast Nevada heavens. Martha rose from the rocking chair and walked to the edge of the porch, her gaze sweeping across the valley that had been her home for 15 years. Every acre held memories: the spot where Samuel had first kissed her, the creek where they had picnicked during their courtship, the pasture where they had dreamed of raising children before fate decided otherwise. But the valley held more than personal memories. It was home to the Paiute families who had lived here for generations before white settlers arrived. Families who now worked alongside Martha in a partnership based on mutual respect rather than conquest. It was home to the Mexican vaqueros who had taught Samuel the art of cattle ranching, men whose expertise had made the Clearwater Ranch one of the most successful in the territory. It was home to the Chinese miners who had stayed after the silver boom ended, finding new lives as farmers and craftsmen in the fertile valley. Blackwood saw only an obstacle to his railroad, land to be acquired and exploited. Martha saw a community worth fighting for, a legacy worth preserving. The railroad tycoon had made one crucial error in his calculations. He had assumed that a widow alone was powerless. He was about to learn that Martha Clearwater was far from alone. and far from powerless. As she prepared to enter the house, a movement in the cottonwoods caught her eye. A figure emerged from the shadows, moving with the silent grace of someone accustomed to traveling unseen. Martha's hand moved instinctively to the Colt Navy revolver, concealed beneath her shawl, then relaxed as she recognized the familiar silhouette. "Evening, Mrs. Martha," came a soft voice with the musical cadence of the Paiute language. Gray Wolf, the unofficial leader of the tribal families in the valley, stepped into the moonlight, his weathered face, marked by 60 years of desert sun and mountain wind, bore an expression of grave concern. "Gray Wolf," Martha replied, switching effortlessly to the Paiute tongue, a skill that never failed to surprise those who underestimated her. "I wondered when you would come." The old man's eyes, dark as obsidian, studied her face with the intensity of someone who could read the land and its people like an open book. "The iron horse brings trouble," he said simply. "My grandson saw the riders from the ridge. They speak of forcing you from the land of your husband." Martha nodded slowly. "The railroad man wants to buy the valley. He's not particular about whether I agree to sell." Gray Wolf was silent for a long moment, his gaze turning toward the eastern ridge, where Blackwood's dust cloud had long since settled. When he spoke again, his voice carried the weight of ancient wisdom. "The white man's law is like smoke. It changes shape with the wind. But some truths are older than law, deeper than greed. This valley remembers the touch of many peoples. It will remember us long after the iron rails rust away to nothing." His words stirred something deep in Martha's chest, a recognition of the larger forces at play. This wasn't just about her ranch, or even about the immediate community. It was about the kind of future that would be built in the American West, one based on cooperation and respect, or one built on the bones of those too weak to resist corporate power. "What do your people counsel?" Martha asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. Gray Wolf's smile was slight, but significant. "My people have learned much about survival. Mrs. Martha. Sometimes the hawk that soars highest makes itself the easiest target for the hunter's arrow, but the snake that moves silently through the grass, that creature chooses its own moment to strike." The metaphor was clear enough. Direct confrontation with Blackwood's wealth and power would be futile, but careful planning, using knowledge that the railroad tycoon didn't possess, might level the playing field considerably. Martha felt a spark of hope kindle in her chest, the first she had felt since watching those ominous riders approach her porch. "Will you carry word to the others?" she asked. "Tell them that Martha Clearwater requests a gathering tomorrow night. There are things that need to be discussed before I give Mr. Blackwood my answer." Gray Wolf nodded once, sharply. "It will be done. The old mine shaft, when the moon reaches its highest point." Perfect. The abandoned silver mine at the northern end of the valley had served as a meeting place for the diverse community that had grown up around Silverbrook Creek. Neutral ground where Paiute, Mexican, Chinese, and Anglo voices could be heard equally. As Gray Wolf melted back into the shadows as silently as he had appeared, Martha allowed herself a small smile. Ezekiel Blackwood thought he was dealing with an isolated widow, ripe for intimidation and exploitation. Instead, he had stumbled into a hornet's nest of unified resistance led by a woman whose family legacy could destroy everything he had built. The game was afoot, and Martha Clearwater held all the cards. "Hey everyone, I hope you're as invested in Martha's story as I am. Where are you watching from? Drop a comment below and let me know what you think Blackwood's next move will be. And if you're hooked on this tale of Western justice, don't forget to hit that subscribe button for more epic stories like this one. The morning sun painted Silverbrook Valley in shades of gold and amber, its light dancing off the creek that gave the settlement its name. Martha stood in her kitchen, grinding coffee beans in the hand-crank mill that had been a wedding gift from Samuel's mother. The familiar rhythm of the task helped calm her thoughts as she prepared for what promised to be a challenging day. The aroma of fresh coffee filled the small kitchen, mixing with the scent of sourdough bread, baking in the wood-fired oven. Through the window above the dry sink, Martha could see her cattle moving slowly toward the creek for their morning drink, their breath visible in the cool desert air. It was a scene of perfect tranquility, betraying nothing of the storm that was brewing beneath the surface. A gentle knock at the back door interrupted her reverie. Without waiting for an invitation, Elena Morales pushed through the screen door, carrying a basket covered with a checkered cloth. The Mexican woman's dark eyes sparkled with warmth, despite the serious expression on her weathered face. "Buenos dias, Martha," Elena said, setting her basket on the scarred wooden table that dominated the kitchen. "I brought fresh tortillas and some of that goat cheese you like. Thought you might need your strength today." Martha smiled despite her worries. Elena had been her closest friend since the early days of her marriage to Samuel, when the young bride from back east had struggled to adapt to the harsh realities of frontier life. The older woman had taken Martha under her wing, teaching her everything from how to birth a calf to which desert plants could heal and which could kill. "Gracias, mi amiga," Martha replied, her Spanish carrying only a slight accent after years of practice. "I have a feeling I'll need all the strength I can get." Elena uncovered her basket, revealing still warm tortillas wrapped in clean linen and a wheel of cheese that smelled like heaven itself. But Martha noticed that her friend's movements were more precise than usual, her efficiency born of nervous energy rather than casual routine. "Grey Wolf came to our casa before dawn," Elena said without preamble. "He told Diego about the railroad man's visit. My husband, he is muy angry. He says no railroad bastardo will steal the land where our children were born." Martha poured coffee into 2 heavy ceramic mugs, adding a dollop of fresh cream to each. "And what do you say, Elena?" The Mexican woman accepted her coffee gratefully, wrapping her hands around the warm mug as if drawing strength from it. "I say that sometimes the old ways are best. My grandfather fought against the French when they tried to make Mexico their colony. He taught me that powerful men always underestimate the power of united people." Through the kitchen window, Martha could see riders approaching from the south, not Blackwood's men this time, but familiar figures from the valley community. Diego Morales rode in the lead, his weathered face grim beneath his wide-brimmed sombrero. Behind him came Chen Wei, the Chinese merchant whose general store served the entire valley, and Father McKenna, the Irish priest who ministered to the diverse spiritual needs of the settlement. "Word travels fast," Martha observed, watching the men dismount near her front porch. "In small communities, secrets are like water in the desert," Elena replied with a knowing smile. "Precious and impossible to contain." The 2 women moved to the front parlor, where Martha's visitors were already settling into the mismatched collection of chairs and benches that served for community meetings. Diego Morales dominated the room with his presence, a man whose barrel chest and powerful hands spoke of decades spent working with horses and cattle. His mustache was streaked with silver, and his dark eyes burned with the intensity of someone who had seen too much injustice in his 50-odd years. Chenwei presented a stark contrast to the burly vaquero, slight of build and precise in his movements. The Chinese merchant possessed an intelligence that Martha had learned to respect deeply. His English was flawless despite the accent that marked him as foreign in the eyes of many Americans, and his knowledge of both business and human nature had proved invaluable to the Valley community on numerous occasions. Father McKenna occupied the middle ground between his companions, both literally and figuratively. The priest's Irish brogue had been softened by years in the American West, but his green eyes still held the fire of a man who had fled poverty and persecution in the old country. His black cassock was dusty from the morning ride, and his graying red hair was disheveled beneath his broad-brimmed hat. "Martha, my dear," Father McKenna began, his voice carrying the authority of the pulpit, even in casual conversation. "We've heard disturbing news about your visitor yesterday evening. How may we be of assistance?" Martha set down her coffee mug and moved to the window, gazing out at the valley that had become the center of this brewing conflict. When she spoke, her voice carried a weight that commanded immediate attention. "Ezekiel Blackwood wants to buy my land for his railroad. He's offered $3,000 for 1,200 acres of prime grazing land, plus water rights that extend back to territorial charter. When I declined to accept immediately, he made it clear that my cooperation was not strictly necessary for his plans to proceed." Diego's fist struck the arm of his chair with a sound like a gunshot. "Hijo de puta, these railroad men! They think they can steal whatever they want from people who have no power to stop them." "Language, Diego," Father McKenna chided gently, though his own expression suggested he shared the sentiment, if not the vocabulary. Chenwei leaned forward in his chair, his dark eyes studying Martha's face with the intensity of a man accustomed to reading the subtleties of human nature. "There is more to this situation than a simple land dispute," he said quietly. "I have seen that look before. Martha, you carry knowledge that weighs heavily upon you." Martha's hand moved unconsciously to her locket, feeling the slight bulge of the folded document within. For 15 years, she had kept her family's secret, sharing it only with Samuel during the final days of his illness. The weight of that knowledge had grown heavier with each passing year, but now, faced with Blackwood's threat, she realized that secrets were only valuable when they could be used to protect the things that mattered most. "My friends," she began slowly, "what I'm about to tell you must remain within this room until we decide together how to proceed. Lives may depend upon our discretion." The three men exchanged glances, recognizing the gravity in her tone. Elena moved closer to Martha, offering silent support with her presence. "You all know that Samuel and I came to this valley in 1860, newlyweds seeking a fresh start in the territories. What you don't know is why we left Kansas so suddenly, or why we chose this particular valley when there were easier places to establish a ranch." Martha opened her locket and withdrew the precious document, unfolding it carefully on the table where all could see. The yellowed parchment seemed to glow in the morning sunlight streaming through the parlor windows. "My great-grandfather, Jeremiah Clearwater, was a surveyor for the federal government during the planning stages of the Transcontinental Railroad. He helped draft the Pacific Railway Act. And more importantly, he insisted on including provisions to protect existing landowners from corporate exploitation." Father McKenna leaned forward to examine the document more closely, his educated eye taking in the official seals and formal language. "Sweet Mary and Joseph," he breathed. "This is an original government document." Section 47, subsection C, Martha continued, pointing to the relevant passage. Any railroad company seeking to claim land through eminent domain must first prove that no existing water rights or territorial charters conflict with their proposed route. If such conflicts exist, the railroad must either pay fair market value or find an alternate route. Chenway's eyes widened as he grasped the implications. Your water rights predate the Railway Act. This document makes Blackwood's threats legally meaningless. More than that, Martha said, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. Jeremiah included a provision that would allow wronged landowners to seek federal investigation of railroad companies that violated Section 47. The document contains evidence that could trigger a congressional inquiry into the Continental Western Railroad's business practices. Diego let out a low whistle. "Cuántos other ranchers has this cabron cheated out of their land?" "Dozens, perhaps hundreds," Martha replied. Samuel spent years researching the railroad's expansion, tracking down families who had been forced off their property by tactics identical to what Blackwood attempted yesterday. We documented everything, gathered testimonies, prepared a case that could bring down his entire empire. Elena's eyes flashed with sudden understanding. "That's why you stayed here after Samuel died. You were waiting for the right moment to act." Martha nodded slowly. "Samuel made me promise to use this knowledge only if absolutely necessary. He said that wielding such power comes with terrible responsibility. Yesterday, when Blackwood threatened not just me, but the entire community, I realized that the moment had come." Father McKenna sat back in his chair, his clerical training warring with his human desire for justice. "The Church teaches us to forgive our enemies, but it also commands us to protect the innocent. This Blackwood has clearly shown himself to be a wolf among sheep." "The question now," Chen Wei said pragmatically, "is how to use this weapon most effectively. A frontal assault rarely succeeds against an enemy with superior resources. We must be strategic." Martha moved to an old trunk in the corner of the parlor, withdrawing a thick leather portfolio that had been Samuel's most treasured possession. The portfolio contained maps, newspaper clippings, legal documents, and photographs, a comprehensive record of the Continental Western Railroad's crimes across multiple territories. "Samuel called this the Book of Judgment," Martha said, laying the portfolio on the table beside the original document. He believed that exposure to public scrutiny would be more devastating to Blackwood than any legal action, because it would destroy the railroad's ability to attract Eastern investors. Diego studied a map showing the railroad's route through Colorado, where 3 ranching families had been driven off their land by tactics ranging from poisoned wells to mysterious barn fires. "This hombre has left a trail of blood and tears across the West. How many more families must suffer before someone stops him?" "Today, that changes," Martha said with quiet determination. "Tonight, we gather the full community council and plan our response. But first, I need to send a message to Carson City." Chenway raised an eyebrow. "To Blackwood?" "To the telegraph office," Martha clarified. "There are people in Washington who need to know that Martha Clearwater is ready to speak." Elena clasped her friend's hand warmly. "What do you need from us?" "Patience, courage, and absolute secrecy until we're ready to act. Martha replied. Blackwood thinks he's dealing with an isolated widow. Let him continue thinking that until it's too late for him to prepare a defense. Father McKenna stood and made the sign of the cross over the assembled group. May God grant us wisdom in the coming trials, and may justice prevail over greed. As her friends prepared to leave, Martha felt a sense of anticipation building in her chest. For 3 years, she had carried the burden of knowledge alone, waiting for the right moment to honor Samuel's memory and fulfill her promise to him. That moment had finally arrived, and she was no longer alone in the fight. The morning sun climbed higher in the Nevada sky, casting short shadows as the community leaders dispersed to spread word of the evening's gathering. None of them noticed the lone rider watching from the eastern ridge, a figure whose presence would have chilled their hearts had they known of his reputation. Silas Crenshaw had earned his money the hard way, with a peacemaker revolver and an utter lack of conscience. Blackwood's instructions had been simple: observe the widow's activities and report anything unusual. What Crenshaw had witnessed through his spyglass was definitely unusual, though he lacked the education to understand the full implications of the documents he had seen displayed in the parlor window. Still, he knew opportunity when he saw it. The railroad man was paying him $50 to watch the widow, but knowledge of whatever conspiracy was brewing in Silverbrook Valley might be worth considerably more to the right buyer. Crenshaw smiled coldly as he turned his horse back toward Carson City, already composing the telegram he would send to certain interested parties in San Francisco and Denver. The web of intrigue surrounding Martha Clearwater's valley was about to become considerably more complex, though none of the participants yet realized how high the stakes had climbed. In less than 24 hours, word of the widow's rebellion would reach ears that could make Ezekiel Blackwood's corporate power seem insignificant by comparison. But for now, Martha busied herself with preparations for the evening's gathering, unaware that the game had already changed in ways that would test her resolve and endanger everyone she held dear. As the sun reached its zenith, casting the valley in brilliant light, a red-tailed hawk circled high overhead, a silent witness to the gathering storm that would soon sweep across Silverbrook Valley like wildfire across dry grass. The abandoned silver mine at the northern end of Silverbrook Valley had once buzzed with the dreams and desperate hopes of prospectors seeking fortune in the Nevada mountains. Now it served a different purpose. Its main tunnel widened and reinforced to accommodate the community meetings that had become essential to the valley's democratic spirit. As the moon reached its highest point in the star-scattered sky, shadows began converging on the mine entrance from all directions. Martha arrived first, carrying a coal oil lantern that cast dancing shadows on the weathered wooden supports that lined the tunnel. The air inside was cool and dry, carrying the faint metallic scent of silver ore and the mustiness of long abandonment. She had chosen to wear her best dress, a deep blue wool that Samuel had bought for her from a traveling merchant 5 years ago, and the silver locket that held her family's greatest secret gleamed at her throat. Gray Wolf emerged from the darkness like a spirit made flesh, followed by 3 younger Paiute men whose faces bore the serious expressions of warriors preparing for battle. The old chief nodded respectfully to Martha before taking his customary position on a naturally formed stone ledge that served as seating for the tribal representatives. Elena and Diego Morales arrived next, accompanied by their eldest son, Miguel, and his wife, Rosa. The younger couple had married just 2 years ago in a celebration that had united the entire valley community, and their presence tonight represented not just the current generation, but the future that hung in the balance. Father McKenna appeared at the tunnel entrance with Chen Wei and his teenage son, Li, the Chinese merchant having closed his store early to attend the crucial meeting. The priest's presence blessed the gathering with spiritual authority, while Chen Wei's practical wisdom had guided the community through numerous challenges over the years. As the group settled into the familiar semicircle that allowed everyone to see and hear clearly, Martha studied the faces illuminated by lantern light. These were people who had chosen to build their lives in this remote valley, creating something unique in the American West, a truly multicultural community based on mutual respect rather than dominance of one group over others. "My friends," Martha began, her voice carrying clearly in the confined space, "we face a crisis that threatens not just my ranch, but the very existence of our community. Before we discuss our response, you need to understand exactly what we're dealing with." She produced the leather portfolio that contained Samuel's research, spreading maps and documents on a flat boulder that served as a table. The assembled group leaned forward as she began to detail the Continental Western Railroad's systematic campaign of intimidation and land theft across multiple territories. In Colorado, the Hendricks family lost 800 acres after their barn mysteriously burned and their cattle were poisoned, Martha reported, pointing to a marked location on one of Samuel's maps. In Utah, 3 Mormon families were driven off their ancestral holdings when railroad-employed gunmen began terrorizing their children. In California, an entire Chinese mining community disappeared overnight after refusing to sell their claims. Gray Wolf's weathered face remained impassive, but his dark eyes gleamed with cold anger. This railroad man believes the law exists only to serve his purposes. He has forgotten that there are older laws, deeper truths that cannot be bought or corrupted. Miguel Morales, whose youthful idealism had not yet been tempered by experience, clenched his fists. "Then we fight gather every man in the valley and show this Blackwood that we will not be driven from our homes like sheep." His father Diego placed a restraining hand on his son's shoulder. "Mijo, anger without wisdom is like a fire without direction. It consumes everything, including those it is meant to protect. We must be smarter than our enemy, not merely braver." Chen Wei nodded approvingly at Diego's counsel. "The railroad has money, political connections, and professional gunmen. We have knowledge, community unity, and the advantage of defending our own ground. But we must use these advantages wisely." Martha opened her locket and withdrew the precious document that represented her family's legacy, explaining in detail the legal protections that Section 47 provided. As she spoke, she could see understanding dawn in the faces around her. This was not just about resisting Blackwood's threats, but about exposing a pattern of corporate criminality that could shake the very foundations of American business. "The question," Father McKenna said slowly, "is how to use this weapon without becoming victims of it ourselves. If we expose Blackwood publicly, he may respond with violence rather than accept legal defeat." "He has already chosen violence," Elena said firmly. "Did you not see the gunmen who rode with him yesterday? They did not come to negotiate, they came to intimidate. Such men do not hesitate to use their weapons when intimidation fails." Li Chen, who had remained silent throughout the discussion, suddenly spoke up in accented but clear English. "My father has taught me that in business, timing is everything. Perhaps we should consider when to reveal our knowledge, not just how, All eyes turned to the young man, who flushed slightly at the attention, but continued with growing confidence. If we wait until Blackwood has committed himself publicly to taking Mrs. Clearwater's land, his humiliation will be complete. But if we act too soon, he may find ways to work around the legal obstacles. Martha felt a surge of admiration for the teenager's insight. What do you suggest, Lee? The young man looked to his father for encouragement before answering. Let Blackwood believe he has won. Allow him to announce his victory to the newspapers. Perhaps even begin construction preparations. Then, when he is fully committed and cannot retreat without losing face, we reveal the truth. Grey Wolf smiled for the first time since the meeting began. The young one speaks wisdom. In hunting, the prey that believes itself safe makes the most careless mistakes. Rosa Morales, who had been following the discussion with the intensity of someone whose future hung in the balance, raised a practical concern. But what if Blackwood doesn't wait 3 days as he promised? What if he decides to take the land by force immediately? Then we make him regret that decision, Martha said quietly, her hand moving to the concealed Colt Navy revolver beneath her shawl. I may be a widow, but I am not defenseless. Samuel taught me to shoot, and Grey Wolf's sons have taught me to move silently through the desert. If Blackwood wants to play a violent game, he will discover that he is not the only one who can hire dangerous allies. The old Paiute chief studied Martha's face with the intensity of someone reading ancient petroglyphs. You speak of violence, but your heart seeks justice. These are not always the same thing. No, Martha agreed. But sometimes justice requires the threat of violence to make itself heard. Diego Morales shifted uncomfortably. I have seen enough blood spilled in my lifetime. If there is a way to defeat this railroad man without adding to the count of graves in the valley, I would prefer that path. As would we all, Father McKenna added. But we must also be prepared to defend ourselves if peaceful means prove insufficient. The Church does not counsel turning the other cheek to those who would murder innocent families. Chenway opened a small leather satchel and withdrew a telegram that had arrived at his store that afternoon. There is something else you should know. I received this message from my cousin in San Francisco, who works for the Pacific Mail Steamship Company. He has heard disturbing rumors about the Continental Western Railroad's financial situation. Martha accepted the telegram, reading it by lantern light while the others waited in tense silence. As she scanned the brief message, her expression grew increasingly grim. What does it say? Elena asked anxiously. According to Chen Wei's cousin, the railroad is heavily in debt to Eastern investors. Blackwood has promised his creditors that the California expansion will be completed by next spring, regardless of obstacles. If he fails to meet that deadline, the entire company could face bankruptcy. Grey Wolf's eyes glittered with understanding. A desperate animal is the most dangerous. This railroad man cannot afford to accept defeat, even if the law demands it. Miguel leaned forward eagerly. Then he will have to try to take the land by force. We should prepare for a siege. Or, Li Chen said thoughtfully, his desperation could be turned into a weapon against him. Desperate men make desperate choices, and desperate choices often reveal the truth about a man's character. Martha folded the telegram carefully, her mind racing through the implications. If Blackwood was facing financial ruin, he might indeed resort to violence rather than accept legal defeat. But his desperation also meant that any public exposure of his crimes would be doubly devastating. It would not only destroy his current plans, but potentially trigger investigations that could uncover financial irregularities as well. I propose we give Mr. Blackwood exactly what he thinks he wants, Martha said slowly. Tomorrow. I will send word to Carson City that I have reconsidered his offer. I will request a meeting to discuss terms, but insist that any agreement be witnessed and documented properly. Diego frowned. You would pretend to surrender. I would give him enough rope to hang himself, Martha clarified. If Blackwood believes he has won, he will become careless. He may reveal information about his other land acquisitions, or make statements that can be used against him later. Meanwhile, we will be documenting everything: his threats, his illegal tactics, his violations of federal law. Father McKenna nodded approvingly. A subtle strategy, but it requires that you place yourself in considerable danger. My dear, Blackwood's men looked like the sort who might decide that dead witnesses tell no tales. That's why I won't be meeting him alone, Martha replied. Chen Wei, would you be willing to serve as a witness to any negotiations? Your reputation for honesty is unquestioned, and your presence would seem natural for a business transaction of this magnitude. The Chinese merchant bowed slightly. I would be honored to assist you, Mrs. Clearwater, but I suggest we also involve Father McKenna in an official capacity. If the meeting is presented as a legal ceremony requiring spiritual oversight, Blackwood will be less likely to attempt violence. Rosa Morales raised another practical concern. What about the rest of us? If you are meeting with the railroad man, how can we help prepare for whatever comes next? Gray Wolf stood slowly, his weathered frame somehow conveying both age and enduring strength. My people will watch the valley borders. If Blackwood brings additional gunmen, we will know of their presence long before they can act. The desert has eyes for those who know how to see. Elena clasped Martha's hand firmly. The women of the valley will gather at my casa tomorrow. We will prepare food and medical supplies, and ensure that the children are safely hidden if violence comes. A community survives by protecting its most vulnerable members. Miguel's wife Rosa nodded eagerly. I can ride to the territorial capital and carry word to the federal marshal's office. If legal help is available, we should secure it before the situation deteriorates further. Martha felt a surge of gratitude for the courage and wisdom of her friends. 3 days ago, she had been a solitary widow facing an impossible challenge. Now she found herself at the center of a unified community, determined to resist corporate tyranny through intelligence and solidarity rather than mere force. There is one more thing, she said, producing a sealed envelope from her coat pocket. Samuel prepared this letter years ago, addressed to Senator William Stewart of Nevada. Stewart was instrumental in passing the Pacific Railway Act, and according to Samuel's research, he has been increasingly concerned about railroad abuses. If our local efforts fail, this letter contains enough evidence to trigger a congressional investigation. Chen Wei examined the envelope with professional interest. The senator is known to be an honest man, despite his reputation for political ruthlessness. If anyone in Washington has the power and inclination to challenge railroad corruption, it would be him. Then we have multiple paths to victory. Father McKenna observed, local legal action, public exposure, and federal intervention if necessary. Mr. Blackwood may find himself facing enemies on several fronts simultaneously. Gray Wolf moved toward the tunnel entrance, pausing to address the group one final time. In 3 days, we will know whether wisdom and courage can triumph over greed and violence. Whatever the outcome, let it be said that the people of Silverbrook Valley stood together when the test came. As the community leaders began to disperse, Martha lingered in the mine tunnel with Elena and Father McKenna. The weight of leadership sat heavily on her shoulders, but it was balanced by the strength she drew from the community's support. "Martha," Elena said quietly, "are you certain you want to face this railroad man directly? There are other ways to fight that would not require you to put yourself in such danger." Martha's hand moved to her locket, feeling the comforting weight of the document that represented her family's legacy. "Samuel made me promise to use this knowledge when the time was right. I cannot honor that promise by hiding in safety, while others face the consequences of Blackwood's greed." Father McKenna placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. "Courage is not the absence of fear, my dear, but the willingness to act despite fear. You have both in abundance." As they emerged from the mine tunnel into the cool night air, Martha looked up at the star-filled sky that arched over Silverbrook Valley like a protective canopy. Somewhere out there, Ezekiel Blackwood was probably planning his next move, confident that a mere widow could not possibly threaten his vast corporate empire. He was about to discover how wrong he could be. The next morning dawned clear and bright, with the kind of crystalline desert air that made distant mountains seem close enough to touch. Martha sat at her kitchen table, composing the letter that would set her plan in motion. The words had to be carefully chosen, submissive enough to convince Blackwood that she was surrendering, but formal enough to create a legal record of whatever transpired. "Mr. Blackwood," she wrote in her careful script, "after much consideration and prayer, I have decided to accept your generous offer for my property. However, as a woman alone in the world, I require that any agreement be properly witnessed and documented to protect both our interests. I propose that we meet at the Carson City Courthouse tomorrow at 10 o'clock in the morning, with appropriate witnesses present to ensure that all proceedings are conducted according to law and custom." She signed the letter with a flourish and sealed it in an envelope addressed to Blackwood at the Grand Hotel. Diego's eldest son would carry it to Carson City within the hour, giving the railroad tycoon just enough time to prepare for what he would assume was his moment of triumph. But Martha Clearwater had learned long ago that appearances could be deceiving. Tomorrow's meeting would indeed mark a moment of triumph, just not for the person Ezekiel Blackwood expected. As she prepared for what might be the most important day of her life, Martha allowed herself one moment of quiet reflection. Samuel's photograph sat on the mantelpiece above the fireplace, his gentle eyes seeming to offer encouragement across the divide between life and death. "I won't let you down, my love," she whispered to the photograph. "Truth finds its level, like water seeking low ground. Tomorrow, the truth about Ezekiel Blackwood begins its journey to the surface." Outside her window, a red-tailed hawk circled high above the valley, its keen eyes watching over the land that so many people were willing to fight to protect. The bird's cry echoed across the desert like a battle cry, heralding the storm that was about to break over Silverbrook Valley. If you're on the edge of your seat, wondering how Martha's going to outsmart Blackwood, you're not alone. The tension is building, and tomorrow's showdown is going to be epic. What do you think will happen when these two forces collide? Drop your predictions in the comments, And don't forget to subscribe for the next thrilling installment. The Carson City Courthouse stood like a monument to frontier justice in the heart of Nevada's territorial capital, its limestone walls weathered by desert winds, but still imposing in their dignity. Martha Clearwater approached the building with measured steps, her black mourning dress rustling softly in the morning breeze. She had chosen the garment deliberately, let Blackwood see a grieving widow seeking to escape her burdens, not the strategist who was about to spring a carefully constructed trap. Chen Wei walked beside her, carrying a leather satchel containing the documents they would need for the day's performance. The Chinese merchant had dressed in his finest suit, a symbol of respectability that would make him an unimpeachable witness to whatever transpired. Behind them, Father McKenna adjusted his clerical collar, his presence lending an air of solemn ceremony to the proceedings. Inside the courthouse lobby, Ezekiel Blackwood waited with barely concealed triumph gleaming in his cold blue eyes. He had brought two companions, a thin, nervous man in a cheap suit, who was obviously a lawyer, and a figure that made Martha's blood run cold despite her outward composure. The second man was tall and lean, with the predatory stillness of a professional gunfighter. His black clothing was expensive but practical, and the ivory-handled peacemaker at his hip was worn with the casual familiarity of a man who had used it often. "Mrs. Clearwater," Blackwood said, rising from his chair with exaggerated courtesy. "How delightful to see you looking so composed. I trust you have reconsidered my generous offer." Martha inclined her head slightly, playing the role of defeated resignation. "I have, Mr. Blackwood. A woman in my circumstances has few choices when faced with the march of progress." Blackwood's smile was sharp as a blade. "Wisdom often comes through adversity. Allow me to introduce my associates, Mr. Pemberton, my legal counsel, and Mr. Crenshaw, who handles my security arrangements." The gunfighter touched the brim of his hat in mock politeness, but his eyes never stopped moving, cataloging potential threats and escape routes with professional efficiency. Martha recognized the type of killer who had learned to hide his nature behind a veneer of civilization, but who remained fundamentally unchanged beneath the surface. "Shall we proceed to the clerk's office?" Blackwood suggested, gesturing toward a door marked County Records. "I've taken the liberty of having the necessary documents prepared. A simple transfer of deed, with payment rendered immediately upon signing." The small records office was cramped and stuffy, lit by two narrow windows that cast harsh rectangles of sunlight across a desk scarred by decades of use. The county clerk, a middle-aged man named Harrison, looked uncomfortable with the proceedings, but had clearly been well compensated for his cooperation. Pemberton spread the documents across the desk with practiced efficiency. Martha examined them carefully, noting that the purchase price had been reduced to $2,500, $500 less than Blackwood's original offer. When she raised an eyebrow at the discrepancy, the railroad tycoon shrugged dismissively. "Administrative costs, my dear woman. Surely you understand that business transactions involve various fees and considerations." It was theft, pure and simple. But Martha gave no sign of recognizing it as such. Instead, she nodded meekly and reached for the pen that Pemberton offered. But before her fingers could close around it, she paused as if struck by sudden doubt. "Mr. Blackwood, I wonder if you might satisfy a widow's curiosity before I sign. What exactly do you plan to do with my valley? Surely it must be quite valuable to your railroad to justify such urgency in acquiring it. Blackwood's chest swelled with pride, unable to resist the opportunity to boast about his grand design. The Silverbrook Valley route will cut 2 full days off our travel time to California. More importantly, it will allow us to bypass the Sierra Nevada passes that have been so troublesome for our competitors. Within 5 years, every ton of freight moving between Denver and San Francisco will pass through what is currently your ranch. Chen Wei leaned forward with feigned interest. Such an ambitious undertaking must require considerable financial backing. I am always curious about successful business ventures. The railroad magnate's eyes gleamed with avarice. The Continental Western has attracted investment from some of the most prominent families in New York and Boston. When our California expansion is complete, we will control transportation across the entire western half of the continent. Martha nodded, as if impressed by his vision. And I suppose you have already secured similar agreements with other property owners along your proposed route. Naturally, Blackwood replied, his confidence making him careless with information. The Henderson Ranch in Colorado, the Morrison claims in Utah, the Chinese Mining Cooperative in California all have seen the wisdom of accepting fair compensation rather than opposing progress. Father McKenna's face remained carefully neutral, but Martha caught the slight tightening around his eyes that indicated he had recognized the names from Samuel's research. These were some of the families who had been driven from their land through violence and intimidation. Their willing cooperation obtained through means that would have shocked any honest observer. I do admire efficiency in business matters, Martha said, accepting the pen from Pemberton's outstretched hand. Before I sign, however, I should mention that there is one small complication regarding my property's legal status. Blackwood's expression shifted slightly, the first hint of concern creeping into his confident demeanor. What sort of complication? Martha opened her reticule and withdrew her locket, letting it rest visibly on the desk between them. It concerns the water rights associated with my ranch. They are somewhat unusual in their origin and scope. Crenshaw's hand moved almost imperceptibly closer to his gun, recognizing the subtle change in the room's atmosphere, even if he didn't understand its source. Chen Wei coughed softly, a prearranged signal that meant he was ready to act if violence erupted. Mrs. Clearwater, Blackwood said with forced patience, I assure you that my legal team has thoroughly researched all aspects of your property's title. There are no complications that cannot be easily resolved. I'm certain that's what you believe, Martha replied gently. However, I think you may have overlooked something rather important. She opened the locket and withdrew the folded document, placing it carefully on the desk where all could see. The yellowed parchment seemed to glow in the harsh sunlight streaming through the windows, its official seals and formal script commanding immediate attention. Pemberton leaned forward to examine the document, his face growing pale as he recognized the government seals and congressional language. Mr. Blackwood, he said in a strangled voice, I believe you should look at this. The railroad tycoon snatched the document from the desk, his eyes racing across the carefully preserved text. As the implications became clear, his face underwent a remarkable transformation from confidence to confusion to dawning horror to barely controlled rage. This is impossible, he whispered. Section 47 was repealed years ago. I'm afraid not, Martha said calmly. The section was amended in 1869 to clarify certain provisions, but it was never repealed. As you can see from the official seals, This document establishes water rights that predate the Pacific Railway Act by 2 years. Under federal law, those rights take precedence over any railroad land grants. Chenway cleared his throat diplomatically. Perhaps Mr. Blackwood would like to reconsider the terms of this transaction, given this new information. Blackwood's composure finally shattered completely. You think you're very clever, don't you? Mrs. Clearwater. But there are other ways to resolve property disputes besides legal maneuvering. Sometimes accidents happen to people who stand in the way of progress. The threat hung in the air like gun smoke, shocking in its naked brutality. Crenshaw stepped forward slightly, his hand now resting openly on his gun butt. But Martha seemed utterly unperturbed by the implicit violence of Blackwood's words. Mr. Crenshaw, she said conversationally, I wonder if you are familiar with the concept of federal jurisdiction. You see, threatening someone in the course of interstate commerce, fraud is a crime that falls under the authority of United States Marshals rather than local law enforcement. The gunfighter's eyes narrowed as he tried to determine whether the widow was bluffing. Before he could decide, the office door opened to admit 2 men whose presence changed the entire dynamic of the confrontation. The first was a burly man in his 50s, wearing a star-shaped badge and carrying a sawed-off shotgun with casual confidence. Juice. Marshal Tom Bradley had served on the frontier for 20 years, and his weathered face bore the marks of a man who had seen every form of human wickedness imaginable. Behind him came a younger man in an expensive suit, his clean-shaven face and careful grooming marking him as an Easterner, despite the confident way he carried himself in the rough Western environment. He carried a leather briefcase and had the alert, intelligent look of a professional investigator. Mrs. Clearwater, Marshal Bradley said with a slight nod. I received your telegram yesterday evening. I believe you mentioned something about violations of federal railway legislation. Martha rose gracefully from her chair, suddenly seeming less like a vulnerable widow and more like a woman who had been planning this moment for years. Indeed, Marshal Bradley, I believe these gentlemen have just provided us with an excellent example of the intimidation tactics that have been used to circumvent Section 47 of the Pacific Railway Act. The younger man stepped forward, extending his hand to Martha. Mrs. Clearwater, I'm Detective Inspector Williams from the Department of the Interior. We've been investigating irregularities in Continental Western Railroad land acquisitions for the past 6 months. Your telegram came at a very opportune moment. Blackwood's face had gone from red to white, his eyes darting between the federal officers and the door as if calculating his chances of escape. Crenshaw had removed his hand from his gun entirely, recognizing that drawing a weapon on federal marshals would be suicide regardless of his skill. This is preposterous, Blackwood blustered. I am conducting legitimate business according to standard industry practices. These accusations are nothing more than the desperate fantasies of a woman seeking to avoid the inevitable progress of civilization. Inspector Williams opened his briefcase and withdrew a thick folder of documents. Mr. Blackwood, we have testimonies from 17 families across 4 territories, all describing identical patterns of intimidation, fraud, and violence associated with continental Western land acquisitions. We also have financial records suggesting systematic manipulation of federal land grants to maximize corporate profit while minimizing compensation to displaced landowners. Martha reached into her reticule again, this time withdrawing Samuel's leather portfolio. Inspector Williams, I believe you will find this collection of evidence quite illuminating. My late husband, spent years documenting Continental Western's violations of federal law. As the inspector began examining Samuel's carefully compiled evidence, Martha felt a profound sense of satisfaction. The trap that she and Samuel had spent years preparing was finally springing shut, and the man who had terrorized countless families across the West was about to face justice. But even as victory seemed within her grasp, Martha noticed Crenshaw's slight nod toward the window, a signal to someone waiting outside. The gunfighter's eyes held a cold calculation that suggested he was far from finished with this confrontation. The game was not over yet, and the most dangerous moves were still to come. Father McKenna, who had remained silent throughout the dramatic confrontation, suddenly spoke up. "Marshal Bradley, I believe there may be additional armed men outside the building. Perhaps we should consider the safety of everyone present." As if summoned by his words, the sound of horses and shouting voices began to filter through the courthouse windows. Martha's heart sank as she realized that Blackwood had prepared for the possibility of legal complications by bringing considerable reinforcement to Carson City. The railroad tycoon's confidence began to return as he heard his men taking positions outside. "It appears that this conversation is far from over. Mrs. Clearwater, you may have surprised me with your little legal gambit, but I have resources that extend far beyond courtroom maneuvering." Marshal Bradley moved to the window and peered out carefully, his experienced eyes taking in the tactical situation with professional assessment. "I count at least 8 men with rifles positioned around the courthouse. They're not wearing badges, so I assume they work for you, Mr. Blackwood." "They work for progress," Blackwood replied coldly. "Sometimes progress requires more direct methods than legal paperwork." Inspector Williams looked up from Samuel's documents, his face grim. "Mr. Blackwood, you are now threatening federal officers in the course of their duties. That is a capital offense under territorial law." "Only if you live to testify about it," Crenshaw said quietly, his hand moving back toward his gun despite the presence of the marshal. The tension in the small office was becoming unbearable, with violence seeming inevitable despite Martha's careful planning. But just as the situation appeared hopeless, a new sound reached their ears, the distinctive war cry of Paiute warriors echoing across the desert air. Through the window, they could see Grey Wolf and a dozen of his best fighters emerging from concealment among the rocks and scrub brush that surrounded Carson City. The old chief had positioned his men perfectly, using the terrain to approach unseen until they could strike at Blackwood's gunmen from multiple directions simultaneously. "It appears," Martha said with quiet satisfaction, "that you underestimated the resources available to a mere widow. Mr. Blackwood, the people of Silverbrook Valley do not abandon their friends when danger threatens." The sound of gunfire began to echo from the courthouse yard as Grey Wolf's warriors engaged Blackwood's hired guns. But this was not the wild, undisciplined shooting of desperate men. It was the controlled, tactical combat of fighters who knew their business and had chosen their ground carefully. Marshal Bradley grinned fiercely as he recognized the shift in the tactical situation. "Mr. Blackwood, I believe your position has become untenable. I suggest you order your men to surrender before this situation deteriorates further." But the railroad tycoon's eyes held the fanatical gleam of a man who had staked everything on a single throw of the dice. "Never I will not be defeated by savages and a scheming widow." He lunged toward the desk where Martha's precious documents lay scattered, clearly intending to destroy the evidence that could bring down his empire. But he had forgotten that Martha Clearwater was far from helpless. The Colt Navy revolver appeared in her hand as if by magic, its barrel steady as she aimed it directly at Blackwood's chest. I wouldn't recommend that course of action. Mr. Blackwood, this revolver belonged to my late husband, and he taught me to use it very effectively. The railroad magnate froze, his eyes fixed on the unwavering gun barrel. In that moment, he finally understood that he had gravely underestimated the woman who had brought his empire to the brink of destruction. Outside, the gunfire was beginning to die down as Grey Wolf's superior tactics carried the day. The battle for Silverbrook Valley was nearly over, but the war for justice in the American West was just beginning. Folks, I've got goosebumps. Can you believe how this showdown is unfolding? Martha has been playing chess while Blackwood was playing checkers, and now all the pieces are coming together. But with Crenshaw still in the room, and that look in his eyes, I have a feeling this isn't quite over yet. What do you think happens next? Let me know in the comments below. And if you're loving this epic tale of frontier justice, smash that subscribe button. The silence that followed the cessation of gunfire outside the courthouse was more profound than any sound Martha had ever heard. Through the window, she could see Grey Wolf's warriors methodically disarming Blackwood's hired guns, their efficient movements speaking to years of experience in both warfare and survival. The old chief himself appeared in the courthouse doorway, his weathered face bearing a slight smile of satisfaction. "The hired killers have surrendered," Grey Wolf announced in his measured English. "3 are wounded. None are dead. My warriors show mercy to those who yield, though these men deserve none." Marshal Bradley nodded approvingly. "Your timing was impeccable. Chief, how did you know to position your men around the courthouse?" "Mrs. Martha sent word yesterday through her friend Elena," Grey Wolf replied. "She said that truth would be spoken today, but that speaking truth sometimes attracts violent men who prefer lies. We thought it wise to be prepared." Martha kept her revolver trained on Blackwood while speaking to the marshal. "I apologize for not informing you of our precautions, Marshal Bradley, but I feared that official channels might be compromised by Continental Western's political connections." Inspector Williams looked up from the documents he had been studying, his expression grim but excited. "Mrs. Clearwater, this evidence is extraordinary. Your husband documented a conspiracy that reaches far beyond simple land fraud. There are connections here to congressional bribery, mail fraud, and possibly even murder." Blackwood's face had gone ashen as the full scope of his exposure became clear. "You don't understand what you're dealing with," he said desperately. "The Continental Western Railroad employs thousands of people, serves communities across the West. You cannot destroy all of that progress for the sake of a few irregularities." Irregularities. Father McKenna stepped forward, his Irish temper finally overriding his clerical restraint. "You speak of irregularities while families have been murdered for their land, while entire communities have been terrorized into submission. There is a special place in hell for men who profit from such suffering." Chen Wei, who had remained quietly observant throughout the confrontation, suddenly spoke up. "Mr. Blackwood, perhaps you would be interested to know that your financial backers in San Francisco have already received copies of this evidence. My cousin in the steamship company has many friends in the banking community. They are concerned about their investments." The railroad tycoon's remaining composure crumbled entirely. "That's impossible. You couldn't have..." Telegraphs travel faster than horses. Mr. Blackwood, Martha said calmly. And Samuel taught me long ago that the most effective strategy is to attack an enemy from multiple directions simultaneously. Inspector Williams stood and moved toward Blackwood, reaching into his coat for a pair of iron shackles. Ezekiel Blackwood, by the authority of the United States government, I am placing you under arrest for conspiracy to defraud the federal government, violation of the Pacific Railway Act, and intimidation of witnesses in a federal investigation. But even as the inspector moved to make the arrest, Crenshaw finally acted. The professional gunfighter had been waiting for the right moment, when everyone's attention was focused on his employer rather than on him. His peacemaker cleared leather with inhuman speed, the ivory grip seeming to flow into his hand like water. "Nobody moves!" Crenshaw snarled, his weapon trained on Marshal Bradley. "Mr. Blackwood and I are walking out of here, and anyone who tries to stop us will die." The small office erupted in tension as 7 people found themselves at the mercy of a killer whose reputation had been earned through ruthless efficiency. Martha's finger tightened on her revolver's trigger, but Crenshaw's gun was already drawn and aimed. Any movement on her part would likely result in the marshal's death. "You cannot escape," Grey Wolf said calmly from the doorway. "My warriors surround this building. Even if you kill everyone in this room, you will not leave Carson City alive." Crenshaw's laugh was like the sound of breaking glass. "Maybe not, but I'll take enough of you with me to make it worthwhile. Now step aside, old man." But Grey Wolf did not move. Instead, he began to speak in the Paiute language, his voice carrying clearly through the courthouse corridors. Martha recognized some of the words. It was a warrior's death song, the chant that Paiute fighters sang when they were prepared to die for something greater than themselves. The effect on Crenshaw was immediate and unsettling. The gunfighter's eyes darted nervously as the otherworldly chanting filled the air, seeming to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. His gun hand, steady as stone moments before, began to waver slightly. "Shut up," Crenshaw screamed. "Stop that damned noise." But Grey Wolf continued to chant, and now other voices were joining his, the warriors outside the courthouse, taking up the ancient song that spoke of courage in the face of death, of standing firm when lesser men would flee. In that moment of distraction, Martha made her choice. Her Navy Colt roared in the confined space, the bullet taking Crenshaw high in the shoulder and spinning him around. His return shot went wild, burying itself in the wooden ceiling as he crashed to the floor. Marshal Bradley was on him instantly, kicking the fallen peacemaker away and pinning the wounded gunfighter with his considerable weight. "That was nicely done, ma'am. Though I have to ask, were you aiming for his shoulder, or were you trying to kill him?" Martha lowered her smoking revolver, her hand steady despite the violence she had just unleashed. Samuel always said that killing should be a last resort. "Marshal, Mr. Crenshaw will live to stand trial, though he may never draw a gun again with that arm." Inspector Williams had used the distraction to secure Blackwood, who stood in iron shackles with the stunned expression of a man whose world had just collapsed around him. "Mrs. Clearwater, your evidence has given us everything we need to dismantle Continental Western's criminal operation, but I suspect this investigation will ultimately reach much higher than one corrupt railroad." Chenway nodded thoughtfully. "My cousin's letter mentioned rumors about political connections in Washington. Senators and congressmen who have profited from railroad stock manipulation. This could become a scandal that rocks the entire government. Martha moved to the window and looked out at the courthouse yard, where Grey Wolf's warriors were helping the wounded men from both sides. The violence was over, but she could see reporters and curious citizens beginning to gather, drawn by the sound of gunfire and the drama unfolding in their normally quiet territorial capital. "Inspector Williams," she said without turning from the window. "What happens now?" The federal investigator was carefully sorting through Samuel's documents, organizing the evidence that would be needed for the trials to come. Now we begin the long process of seeking justice for everyone who has been wronged by Continental Western's criminal activities. There will be trials, congressional hearings, financial investigations. It may take years to fully unravel this conspiracy. Father McKenna approached Martha, his pastoral instincts overriding his excitement about the victory they had achieved. "My dear, you have carried a tremendous burden for many years. How do you feel now that it has been lifted?" Martha considered the question carefully, her hand moving once again to the locket that had held her family's secret for so long. "I feel free, Father. For the first time since Samuel's death, I feel truly free." Grey Wolf entered the office, his weathered face bearing an expression of quiet satisfaction. "The wounded are being cared for, and the prisoners are secure. But there is something else you should know. Mrs. Martha, word of this day's events will spread quickly across the territories. Other families who have suffered at the hands of railroad men will take courage from your example." Marshal Bradley stood up from securing Crenshaw, wiping blood from a cut on his knuckles. "The chief is right. What happened here today is bigger than just one land dispute. You've started something that could change how business is conducted across the entire West." Elena Morales appeared in the doorway, her face flushed from hard riding. "Martha, we heard the gunshots from 5 miles away. Are you hurt?" Behind Elena came Diego and Miguel, their faces showing the mixture of relief and pride that Martha had come to associate with the people of Silverbrook Valley. These were not just neighbors or employees. They were family, bound together by shared struggles and mutual loyalty. "I'm unharmed, mi amiga," Martha assured her friend. "And Mr. Blackwood has learned that stealing land from widows is more difficult than he anticipated." Diego surveyed the scene: the wounded gunfighter, the shackled railroad tycoon, the federal officers, and the scattered evidence of corporate criminality. "Dios mío, you have brought down a giant, Martha Clearwater." "We brought him down," Martha corrected. "None of this would have been possible without the courage and support of our entire community." Inspector Williams closed his briefcase and stood to address the growing crowd. "Ladies and gentlemen, what we have witnessed today represents a turning point in the relationship between corporate power and individual rights in the American West. Mrs. Clearwater's courage in exposing this conspiracy will benefit countless families across multiple territories." But Martha held up her hand to interrupt the inspector's speech. "If I may, Inspector Williams, there is something I need to say to my friends and neighbors." She moved to the center of the room, where everyone could see and hear her clearly. When she spoke, her voice carried the authority of someone who had faced down overwhelming odds and emerged victorious. 3 years ago, when Samuel died, I thought my life was ending. I was alone, frightened, and uncertain whether I could survive in this harsh land without the man who had been my strength and my guide. But I learned something important during those dark months. No one is truly alone who stands for truth and justice. She gestured toward the people who had supported her through the crisis. Grey Wolf and his warriors showed me that courage comes in many forms. Elena and Diego taught me that family is not just blood, but choice. Chen Wei demonstrated that wisdom and patience can overcome brute force. Father McKenna reminded me that faith can move mountains, even mountains of corporate greed. Elena wiped tears from her eyes as Martha continued. Samuel always said that truth finds its level, like water seeking low ground. Today, the truth about Ezekiel Blackwood and his railroad has found its level. But more importantly, the truth about our community, our strength, our unity, our refusal to be intimidated by those who would exploit us, that truth has also been revealed. Grey Wolf stepped forward, speaking in his careful English. Mrs. Martha speaks wisdom. This valley has been blessed by the spirits because it shelters people who choose cooperation over conquest, justice over greed. May this day mark the beginning of a new understanding between all peoples of the West. Marshal Bradley cleared his throat, bringing the emotional moment back to practical matters. Mrs. Clearwater, while I admire your community spirit, we still have legal proceedings to consider. You'll need to testify before a federal grand jury, and there will likely be congressional hearings as well. I understand, Marshal, Martha replied, but I have one request. When this story is told in the newspapers and government reports, please remember that it was not one person who defeated Ezekiel Blackwood. It was a community that refused to be divided and conquered. Inspector Williams nodded approvingly. Your request will be honored, ma'am. In fact, I believe your story will inspire other communities to stand up against corporate intimidation. As the federal officers prepared to transport their prisoners to the territorial jail, Chen Wei approached Martha with a thoughtful expression. Mrs. Clearwater, there is something you should consider. Continental Western's collapse will leave many legitimate railroad workers without employment. Perhaps Silverbrook Valley could become a model for ethical business practices in the railroad industry. The suggestion sparked immediate interest from Diego. You mean we could start our own transportation company, one that treats workers fairly and respects property rights? Martha felt a surge of excitement at the possibility. Samuel had always dreamed of building something lasting, something that would benefit the entire region rather than just enriching distant investors. It's an intriguing idea. Chen Wei, what would we need to make such a venture possible? Father McKenna joined the conversation with enthusiasm. The church has connections with investor groups in the East who prioritize ethical business practices. I could make some inquiries about financing. Grey Wolf listened to the discussion with growing interest. My people know every trail and water source between here and California. Such knowledge would be valuable for any transportation company. As the afternoon sun slanted through the courthouse windows, Martha realized that what had begun as a desperate defense of her ranch was transforming into something much larger, a blueprint for building a different kind of future in the American West. 6 months later, the morning sun painted Silverbrook Valley in shades of gold and green as Martha Clearwater stood on the platform of the newly constructed railroad depot. The building was modest, but well-crafted, built from local stone and timber according to designs that respected both the natural landscape and the needs of the diverse community it served. The Silverbrook Valley Transportation Company had become a reality through a combination of factors that no one could have predicted. The federal investigation of Continental Western had revealed financial irregularities so extensive that the company's assets had been seized and auctioned to pay defrauded investors. Martha's consortium, backed by Eastern Quaker investors, recommended by Father McKenna, had acquired the seized rail lines at a fraction of their original cost. But more importantly, they had acquired something that money couldn't buy: the respect and loyalty of the workers who had been exploited by Blackwood's regime. Engineers, conductors, and track crews had flocked to join a company that promised fair wages, safe working conditions, and profit sharing for all employees. Elena Morales emerged from the depot building, carrying a telegram that had just arrived on the morning wire. Her face bore an expression of excitement, mixed with concern, as she approached Martha. "Noticias from Washington," Elena announced, handing over the yellow paper. "The congressional hearings have begun." Martha read the telegram quickly, her eyebrows rising as she absorbed the information. Senator Stewart has called for a full investigation of railroad practices across all territories. And listen to this: they're proposing new legislation that would require community approval for any major transportation projects. "The Clearwater Act?" Elena asked with a knowing smile. "Apparently, that's what they're calling it," Martha replied, though she seemed more embarrassed than pleased by the honor. Samuel would have found that amusing. He always said that the best monuments are built from principles, not stone. Chenway approached from the direction of his expanded general store, which now served as the unofficial headquarters for the valley's growing commercial district. His son Lee walked beside him, wearing the crisp uniform of a railroad telegraph operator, a position that had been created specifically to ensure reliable communication between the valley and the outside world. "Mrs. Clearwater," Chenway said with a formal bow that had become his customary greeting. "The freight manifest for today's eastbound train includes 40 head of cattle from the Morales Ranch, 30 tons of silver ore from the reopened mines, and 15 crates of pottery from the Paiute Craftsmen's Cooperative." Martha nodded with satisfaction. The transportation company had become exactly what Samuel had dreamed of: a catalyst for economic development that benefited everyone in the community rather than enriching distant investors at local expense. "Any word from Gray Wolf about the Nevada legislature's proposal?" Martha asked. Leachin answered with the enthusiasm of a young man who had found his calling in the complex world of territorial politics. "Chief Gray Wolf sent word through the tribal council. The Paiute Nation is prepared to support the new treaty, provided that mining rights remain under tribal control and that water access is guaranteed in perpetuity. The proposed treaty would formalize the relationship between the Paiute people and the territorial government, creating a legal framework based on mutual respect rather than military conquest. It was unprecedented in the American West. But then again, Silverbrook Valley had become accustomed to setting precedents. Father McKenna rode up to the depot on his aging but reliable horse, his cassock dusty from the morning journey, to minister to the outlying ranches. The priest had aged visibly during the months of legal proceedings and congressional testimony, but his eyes still burned with the fire of a man fighting for justice. "Martha, my dear," he called out as he dismounted. "I've just returned from Carson City. Judge Morrison has rendered his verdict in the Blackwood case." The group gathered around the priest eagerly. The trial of Ezekiel Blackwood had become a sensation across the nation, with newspapers from New York to San Francisco following every detail of the proceedings. The railroad tycoon's conviction was never in doubt, but the severity of his sentence would send a message about how seriously the federal government intended to take corporate crime. 25 years in federal prison, Father McKenna announced, plus complete forfeiture of all assets connected to Continental Western Railroad. The judge said that Blackwood's crimes represented a betrayal of the public trust that strikes at the very heart of American democracy. Diego Morales, who had been loading cattle cars nearby, let out a whoop of celebration that echoed across the valley. Justicia, finally. There is justice for all the families that Cabron destroyed. Martha felt a complex mixture of emotions as she absorbed the news. Satisfaction at seeing justice served, certainly, but also a profound sadness for all the lives that had been destroyed before Blackwood's crimes were finally exposed. The victory felt incomplete without Samuel there to share it. Elena seemed to read her thoughts. Your husband would be proud. Martha, not just of the victory, but of how you achieved it with truth and community rather than violence and revenge. A distant whistle announced the approach of the morning passenger train from Sacramento, its steam plume visible against the clear desert sky. The locomotive was a modest affair compared to the massive engines that Continental Western had operated, but it was clean, well-maintained, and operated by crews who took pride in their work. As the train pulled into the station, Martha was surprised to see several passengers disembark who were clearly not locals. Their Eastern clothing and urban mannerisms marked them as outsiders, but their purposeful movements suggested they had come to Silverbrook Valley for specific reasons. A distinguished-looking man in his 60s approached Martha directly, his bearing suggesting someone accustomed to positions of authority. Mrs. Clearwater, I'm Senator William Stewart of Nevada. I've come to see for myself the community that has become a model for ethical development in the territories. Martha felt a moment of nervousness at meeting the powerful politician, whose support had been crucial to their success. But as she looked into Stewart's eyes, she saw genuine curiosity and respect, rather than the calculating coldness she had learned to associate with men of power. Senator Stewart, welcome to Silverbrook Valley, Martha replied, extending her hand with the confidence of someone who had learned that truth was the equal of any political authority. I hope you find our little experiment worthy of your attention. Behind the senator came a woman whose presence caused Martha's heart to race with recognition. Sarah Winnemucca, the famous Paiute interpreter and advocate, had traveled from her home in Nevada to witness the signing of the historic treaty between the Paiute Nation and the territorial government. Mrs. Clearwater, Sarah said in her melodious voice, Gray Wolf has told my people many stories about your courage and wisdom. I am honored to meet the woman who helped bring justice to the desert. The arrival of such distinguished visitors created a festive atmosphere in the small depot, with more and more valley residents gathering to witness what was clearly a historic moment. But Martha found herself thinking not of the celebrities and politicians, but of the ordinary people whose faith and courage had made this day possible. Gray Wolf appeared as if summoned by her thoughts, moving with his characteristic silent grace despite his advanced years. The old chief wore traditional ceremonial dress for the treaty signing, his presence lending an air of ancient dignity to the proceedings. Mrs. Martha, he said in his careful English, the spirits of this place are pleased. They whispered that this valley will be remembered long after we have all joined the ancestors. Senator Stewart cleared his throat, drawing attention back to the official purpose of his visit, Ladies and gentlemen, I have come here today not just to witness the signing of a treaty, but to announce new federal legislation that will transform how development occurs throughout the American territories. He withdrew an official-looking document from his briefcase, holding it up for all to see. The Community Development Act of 1876 will require genuine consultation with local populations before any major transportation or mining projects can proceed. It establishes legal protections for water rights, guarantees compensation at fair market value for any property acquisitions, and creates federal oversight to prevent the kind of abuses that continental Western practiced for so many years. The crowd erupted in cheers, but Martha found herself thinking of Samuel's words about truth finding its level like water seeking low ground. The legislation was important, but the real victory was deeper. It lay in proving that diverse communities could unite around shared principles of justice and mutual respect. As the formal ceremonies began, Martha stepped back from the crowd and found herself alone for the first time in months. The weight of leadership, testimony, and constant public attention had been exhausting, and she welcomed the brief moment of solitude. Elena approached quietly, recognizing her friend's need for reflection. "En qué piensas?" "Martha." "I was thinking about Samuel," Martha replied softly. "He used to say that the true measure of a person's life was not what they accumulated for themselves, but what they left behind for others. I think he would be pleased with what we've built here." Elena smiled warmly. "I think he would be proud that his widow became a leader who changed the course of history." "No," Martha corrected gently. "He would be proud that his widow learned to trust in the wisdom and courage of her community. I didn't change history alone. We changed it together." As the afternoon wore on and the ceremonies concluded, Martha found herself standing once again on the depot platform, watching the sun begin its descent toward the western mountains. The valley stretched before her in all its golden beauty, no longer threatened by corporate greed, but thriving as a model of what the American West could become when people chose cooperation over conquest. The red-tailed hawk that had watched over the valley during the dark days of Blackwood's threats still circled overhead, its cry echoing across the desert like a song of victory. But now it was joined by other birds, other voices, creating a chorus that spoke of life, hope, and the endless possibility of renewal. In her locket, Martha still carried the document that had brought down Ezekiel Blackwood's empire, but now it was accompanied by other papers, the charter of the Silverbrook Valley Transportation Company, the deed to the community school, and the treaty that would protect Paiute rights for generations to come. Truth had indeed found its level, just as Samuel had always promised. And in finding that level, it had lifted up an entire community and pointed the way toward a different kind of future for the American West. As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Martha Clearwater smiled and headed home to the ranch house where it all began, knowing that the legacy she and Samuel had dreamed of was now secure in the hands of a community that would never forget the price of freedom or the power of standing together when truth itself was under attack. The railroad tycoon's attack on a widow's valley had indeed been exposed by her family legacy, but the legacy was far greater than any single document or legal provision. It was the legacy of ordinary people choosing to do extraordinary things when the moment demanded courage, wisdom, and an unshakable faith in the power of truth to overcome even the most powerful forms of corruption. And in the end, that legacy would prove to be more enduring than any railroad, more valuable than any fortune, and more powerful than any tyrant who mistook greed for strength and intimidation for authority. Well, my friends, what an incredible journey we've taken together through the dust and drama of the Old West. Martha Clearwater's story shows us that sometimes the most powerful weapon against injustice is simply refusing to be silent when others are being wronged. Her courage, combined with the strength of a united community, toppled an empire built on greed and violence. I hope this tale has inspired you as much as it has inspired me. Remember, truth really does find its level, just like water seeking low ground, and when it does, it has the power to wash away even the most entrenched corruption. Where are you watching from today? Drop a comment below and let me know what you thought of Martha's incredible story. Did her victory inspire you to think differently about standing up for what's right in your own community? And if you loved this epic tale of frontier justice, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. I've got more amazing stories of courage, adventure, and triumph coming your way. Until next time, keep seeking the truth, and never underestimate the power of ordinary people doing extraordinary things when justice calls. Thanks for joining me in Silverbrook Valley, and I'll see you in the next story.